Hello and welcome into the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports, and I'm joined once again today by Kevin Flaherty. We're going to break down what was a busy kind of first few days of July as KU kind of gets close to putting a bow on its 2024 recruiting class here as kind of the start of these senior seasons start to get underway, workouts still going on, and as KU looks to get focused on its own 2023 season. Kevin, we're both coming off a little bit of a vacation. I just
Sure.
got back into town yesterday after spending about a week in Mexico, which was a lot of fun. Was able
Yeah.
to relax, got some work in, obviously, with two commitments. But Kevin, what have your vacations been looking like here over the last couple weeks?
Yeah, I spent a week out in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. Came back with more moonshine than probably anyone or two people should come back with. But that's what you do when you're out there. You look for bears, you enjoy nature, get some hiking done, grow out the beard a little bit, and then find yourself some moonshine. How was Mexico?
It was fun. It was fun. I hadn't been fishing on the ocean before, so we
Yeah.
went and did that. That was a blast, and it was
Catch
for a
anything?
family reunion. Oh yeah, we caught some mahi and some kind of tuna as well. So it was a blast.
Nice,
Caught some shark. That was
nice.
weird, but yeah, I'd never done like deep sea fishing before, so that was a blast. But it was a family reunion, so it's always a little interesting when you're doing the vacation, spending time with the grandparents, things like that.
Sure.
So it was a lot of fun, but I'm so happy to be back. I didn't think I'd ever be happier to be back in a routine. And Kevin, let's just dive right into this. It's been a huge week for the Kansas football program on the recruiting trail. Instead of flipping a coin to decide who we're going to start with, I'll just let you pick. Who do you want to start with? The guy that committed first, or arguably the biggest commitment in KU football history?
Yeah, I had this whole transition mapped out where I was going to go from, Lance Leipold also caught a couple big fish,
Oh,
in his own expeditions, and it's interesting because I almost feel like we should mention both as a group and then get into one of them. And so, the
sure.
first to commit, Deshawn Werner, the edge rusher from Desert Edge, completing the Desert Edge, trio. Although they are also hitting up Desert Edge in 2025, so it's maybe not the last guy from Desert Edge overall, but really good defensive end prospect. Has all the things that you look for. Probably would have been the single biggest get on most weeks, for Kansas. And I know what his rankings say and things like that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then a few days later, something else happened. Michael, what did you think about Kansas's second get of July?
Yeah, I don't know about surprise, but I think the feeling maybe was at least at the end of the recruiting period, right when the dead period started, right after the final visits, was kind of maybe Dak Brinkley will wait until the fall. He had taken the visit to Kansas in early June, was a part of kind of that first big official visit weekend. We'd reported then, right, that KU made a very strong impression on him and was definitely in the mix to land him. He buys his time, waits, takes a visit to SMU, and then again, it felt like he was probably going to wait until the season. But I think there's a chain reaction here where Deshawn Warner goes and makes his commitment public, right? Or in
Yep.
the afternoon, right, on July 1st. And then my understanding is that Dak Brinkley called KU that same day and gave them his commitment. And so it's one of these kind of with a swoop, Kansas knocks out its big, really need at defensive end with two really high potential guys. You look at Brinkley, the offer list. Obviously, I think fans might have some questions about the official visit list. We can probably talk about that as well, where maybe some programs see him as maybe a bit of a tweener. I think he's the perfect fit for what Kansas looks for. And I think generally this recruiting cycle, you've seen Kansas rely on that, right? Their evaluation of where a player fits in their program, and they've really, really stuck to that. And I think it pays off with a guy like Dak Brinkley, where you look at his recruitment, right? Kansas offers him in January. Jordan Peterson really recruits him hard. Taiwo Anatolu gets involved. Lance Leipold's involved. it's a whole staff effort really recruiting him and his family, and it pays off with a guy who, Kevin, if he signs in December,
Sure.
will be and keeps his composite rating. Got to mention that as well. But he'll be the highest rated high school commitment for Kansas in history since 2002, when really all this started to happen. And so I think it's just a huge commitment. Kevin, I don't know if you got a heads up on it, or if I don't think I I kept it quiet. Like I didn't text anybody, so maybe you didn't. But what was your first reaction when you saw us pop through on the 4th of July?
Yeah, I thought, again, like you said, it wasn't necessarily a surprise that he chose Kansas. Maybe it was a little bit of a surprise, the timing that he did it, as early as he did. And I think that's a little bit of a theme in this class. A lot of these guys, it seems like
Mm-hmm.
Kansas puts itself into a strong position with, and they commit, and you wind up hearing, well, we thought this guy was going to stretch this out a little bit longer. It was like that with Isaiah Marshall. Was a guy that I think Kansas thought, hey, this is a guy that we're really going to have to go to war for, and fight off people with the stick, and he committed really early, has been a big part of recruiting this class himself, and so the timing, I think, struck me more than anything. But like you said in the past too, Kansas knows what it values in terms of what they look for at certain positions, and they don't go outside of that. They know what they want, and those are going to be the guys that they go after. If they didn't get Dak Brinkley, they were probably going to go get somebody else kind of like Dak Brinkley for this spot. And so I think when you look at it that way, and you look at his fit at Kansas, I think he plugs perfectly into sort of that weak side defensive end spot at Kansas. When you look at the guys they've had there, their first year, they had Kyron Johnson, who was probably 225 pounds, at the time. And while Kyron maybe wasn't the ideal physical fit for that position, last year Lonnie Phelps was what, probably 240, maybe 245 ish. I know he was, I think, like 244 at the combine, but mid-season he was probably somewhere around there. You look at this year, a guy that is going to have a chance to be there at that spot is a guy like Dylan Brooks, who's 235, 240 pounds. You're maybe hoping he gets a little bit more weight there. And so you look at a guy like Dak Brinkley, and some places are going to say, hey, we want both of our defensive ends to be 260 pounds, 255 pounds, whatever. I really think that Brinkley is a guy heading to Kansas that kind of fits what they already look for in that size archetype. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think you look at, so I think let's start here, right? Fit. The athleticism is, I think, his biggest asset, right? You see some of these clips for those watching on the YouTube channel. You see how fast he gets off the edge, and you look at what he does at the high school level there. It's impressive, right? The way that he
Yeah,
moves, the way he comes off the ball. These are really, really impressive things. And I think there are probably some schools that felt like, okay, we're a 3-4 defense, or we're kind of a 3-3-5, one of those modern defenses. Well, is he kind of a three-man front defensive end? Definitely not, right? I don't think he's got the ability to get up to that, 265-pound defensive end mark that I think some
sure.
schools like that might want. Well, then, okay, is he a linebacker? Then you look at him and you say, okay, yeah, I would say maybe the fluidity is there to play linebacker. Maybe other schools don't. That's perfectly fine. But I think for what Kansas asks that weak side defensive end spot to do, it's get off the ball, attack, attack, attack. And that's exactly what Dak Brinkley does. What I also love is the fact that he has played in space, right? He's played as an
Yep.
outside linebacker in a 3-4 front. What does that mean? Well, we see KU drop that defensive end into space sometimes, right? We saw it happen
Yep.
with Lonnie Phelps last year. Well, this is a guy now that's comfortable doing that. And so I think fit, like if you're talking about high school defensive end who's going to play most likely on the weak side, what does that player look like? I'd probably hold up Dak Brinkley and say, yeah, this is it. Like this is probably
Sure.
the archetype for Kansas recruiting this position. And I think the offer list shows it, right? I think the offer list shows you the athleticism, the measurables, the size. Those are the things that get you an offer from these programs like Penn State, Oregon, Oklahoma. And then you get into the nitty gritty, which is why you decide who are the guys that are going to be the ones that you take in the class. And so overall, I look at it and say, he fits the mold. What comes next? I think now it's just, can Kansas really cross the line with them?
Yeah, I think so too. And you look at the fact he worked at outside linebacker at Texas A&M camp. I mean, and didn't look out of place according to our Texas A&M guys. This is a guy who's run an 11 200-meter dash. I mean, when you add the different parts of all of that, I think that it does add up. I think Kansas did a really good job to put itself in a strong position to get that commitment. And I thought it was interesting too. We'll talk more about this, I'm sure, a little bit later, but when you talked to him, or when 24/7 talked to him, I can't remember, was it Mike Roach that talked to him right after the Kansas visit? And one of the
Yeah,
things that
yeah, yeah.
Brinkley,
Mike texted him.
yeah,
Hmm.
and one of the things that Brinkley had said really stood out was he felt like Kansas really displayed a family atmosphere more than other places that he had been to. And so when people start asking all these questions, is this guy going to stick? Is he going to flip? Is he going to do whatever else? You want to build the foundations that give a guy a reason to succeed. And yes, the on-field stuff is a big part of it, but the other side of it is you want to build those relationships, and you want him to feel like, hey, this is home. Hey, this is family. And I think Kansas has done a really good job of emphasizing that to him.
Exactly. And I think, you mentioned the word family. And I think that's something that really has come across. You talk to a lot of these guys that have committed, right? And I think you made a really good point, Kevin, earlier when you said that guys are shutting down their recruitments, right? And committing maybe sooner than people thought.
Yeah,
Jalen Todd is an example of that, right? I think a
sure.
lot of people believed that he was going to go visit Iowa at the end of the month. He didn't. Austin Alexander, I think, is the one that probably sparked a lot of this, right? He had the
Yep,
visits to Indiana, Purdue, Illinois. He kind of said, I'm good. I'm going to go to Kansas, and canceled it. I think that type of decision right there sets the precedent for someone like Jalen Todd to do that, for someone like Dak Brinkley to say, hey, look, Kansas is a school that's prioritized me. It feels like home. Why am I going to wait? Why do I owe it to these other schools? If Kansas is a spot where I want to go, then why am I going to wait around until the fall to see what else comes when Kansas could fill up at defensive end as well? So I think KU's
sure.
done a really good job of that. And I think a really good example of that too is someone like Deshawn Warner, where
Yep.
you talk to him and, Kansas from day one prioritized him. And talking to him, he really mentioned that this Seguro showcase, Kevin, for folks that don't understand, right? Arizona high schools, they have this big kind of showcase in Phoenix. A lot of college coaches go to it. And Kansas had Jordan Peterson, Taiwo Onatolu, and Chris Simpson there, all wearing the Kansas polo or Kansas sweatshirt, whatever, with the Jayhawk on it. And they had the most coaches there, right? Arizona State had a coach there. Washington had a coach or two, but 3 coaches there from the same school, all there to watch those Desert Edge guys, really stood out to Deshawn Warner, John Kamara, Dre, Gibson as well. So these are all guys that now see that. And I think Kansas did a great job with that. In terms of the story here, I mean, this is pretty. I give a lot of props to DJ for the way that he handled this, because he wanted his decision to be quiet. No
Yep.
leaks, nothing. He wanted to surprise people. He wanted to surprise John. He wanted to surprise Dre. So he committed to Kansas on his visit. On that Sunday, he gave Kansas his commitment. Well, he waited until late in the week to tell Texas, wait late in the week to tell Washington. Well, typically, Kevin, and I think you know this as well, working at Texas, that at bigger schools, when a kid commits, they tell the coaching staff where they're going to go. Well, I think Deshawn is smart enough to know that at a school like Texas, there's a good chance that you tell them where you're going. They're probably going to put it out there that, oh, we missed on him. He's going here. And that would result in a crystal ball pick. Well, that's kind of what happened, and kind of did a little misleading, a little deke maneuver, told Texas he was going to go to Washington. Washington crystal ball comes in. He commits to Kansas that Saturday. My crystal ball didn't change. I'll leave it at that,
Yeah. It,
but no, so I think overall, this is one of those where credit to DJ. He wanted to keep it quiet. I think you can see how much it meant for his teammates too. I don't have the video here for folks watching on YouTube, but it's a really cool video. If you go to, I think my social media on my Twitter, if Twitter's still working, you click on the media and you can go see it. But, Kamara, John, and Dre were just so excited. They jumped on him, really happy. And I think it's a cool story, right? You got 3 guys from the same high school class. 2 of them are their cousins, and they're all going to get to go play college football together. And I think KU's getting a darn good player too. I'll let you talk about that, because I think you have some thoughts about just Deshawn as a player and what he is and what he can be.
yeah, I think too, in our line of work, how many times do we wind up breaking a commitment, not from the staff that we're immediately talking to, or the staff that winds up getting him, but you wind up hearing it from the other staff. You wind up hearing it from one of the other staffs involved in the recruitment. Maybe they're looking at 5 different schools, and so you don't just ask the one school about it. You ask the other schools if you have a chance and say, "Hey, what do you think? Where do you think this guy's going?" And so kind of cool for DJ to pull the little switcheroo there and make that work. But no, he's a really good player. And like I said, we would talk a little bit about the ranking. Our guys do a great job, and they see so many different guys and across the country, and it's so tough to compare a kid from Hiawatha, Kansas, to a kid who's out in Wyoming, to a kid who's in Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. With Deshawn, I have to think, and I think you're there with me, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. I have to think this is a guy that if we get somebody out to see him in person as a senior, that he'll have a chance to have that rankings bump. I think the tape is there. I think what you see on tape physically in terms of him being a guy that very much legitimately looks a legitimate 6'4" and has a lot of length. You and I talked before we started. I said he looks like a shooting guard. Like if you dumped him out, on a basketball court somewhere, that's the way that he would look. And it's kind of funny because, Dak Brinkley is thicker now. He's more boxy. He's a little bit shorter. And he's going to play the weak side spot. But Warner's got such a big frame. And when you look at that, I don't see him having any issue getting up to the size of a guy like Jeremy Robinson or somebody like that when you look at that strong side defensive end spot. Now, what I will say, I really liked Jeremy Robinson coming out. And he was a guy that I had talked quite a bit about. Deshawn Warner is so fluid for his size, and he changes direction so well for his size. I really think, when you look for an edge guy, the things you want are you want length and you want twitch, you want athleticism. And I think Warner is a guy who gives you that frame to be able to get a lot bigger. But at the same time, Swain, I really like him athletically in terms of the way he moves, the way he can change direction, and the way, he's got, I tweeted about it, but he's got that Lonnie Phelps move of starting to the outside, and he's so quick when he puts his foot in the ground of being able to cut inside across the tackle's face. And, just a guy that has tremendous quickness when he does that.
Yeah, and this is something I'll write about. I think next week I got to plan out my schedule, but he started his career at Desert Edge as a wide receiver. And I think that's what you see sometimes with his pass rush moves is the plant and go ability of someone that looks like they've played wide receiver for a good portion of their life. And I love the motor he plays with, the tenacity he plays with. My player comp for him and our player profile that I do for all these commitments, I thought he looks like a guy that's kind of like Dorrance Armstrong coming out of high school, right? I think the tape, the athleticism off the edge, the natural kind of size and frame, all those things are there for him. And so I like that comp too. You mentioned Jeremy Robinson. I think that's a good one as well. I think Warner's one where you could say, hey, he's going to play on the weak side. Hey, he's going to play on the strong side. I think he's a guy that it's all going to depend on how his body develops. And they've got a good strength conditioning program at Desert Edge. And now it's just going to be, what can Matt Gildersleeve and the coaching staff at KU do with just more time on task, right? The nutrition program, all these different things that you get at a Power 5 program like Kansas, how can that body develop over time? But overall, you look at the two guys Kansas got, right? Multiple Power 5 offers, right? For Warner, right? He could have committed to Washington. He could have committed to Oregon State. Texas, if he maybe just depends on how the other players would have shaken out there. But I just look overall and say these two players are really the types of players that can change a defensive line group in the future, because we've talked about it before, Kevin, right? That the defensive line group needs more young bodies, right? It needs freshmen, needs redshirt freshmen, and they've added guys through the portal, but they need more young blood. And I think these two guys are going to be great. And now all of a sudden you're looking at this class overall in the top end of the class, Kevin. Overall it's pretty defense heavy, right? In terms of ordering this based off 24/7 sports.
6.
Exactly, right? And so you go Dak Brinkley to Austin Alexander to Damani Maxon to Jalen Todd, right? the first 4 players in this class in terms of composite rating are on defense, right? You got 3 defensive backs in Alexander, Maxon, and Todd, 1 defensive end in Brinkley, right? Then Harry Stewart at running back, then Deshawn Warner at defensive end. And so I think defense, this is a question we got from someone on Twitter. What position groups on the offensive and defensive side were top priority for this class? I think just defense in general, really improving the overall athleticism of the group was something that was a big priority for them. And I think they really accomplished that. And outside of that, I think quarterback, was a really big priority, and they were able to accomplish that as well. But I mean, Kevin, you look at the ranking, right? 38 overall. It's the highest average commit rating, just a shade under 87 once Kenny and Nene gets factored into the composite. It's got basically the highest rated high school commit of all time for Kansas. It's got the most talent overall. 3 4-stars is the most since 2010. Like overall, where do you feel like Kansas is with this class? I think it's easily right now on track to be the best recruiting class for Kansas since 24/7 Sports started covering this stuff in 2010. But just what are your kind of general thoughts on the class here as we get into really the thick of July?
Yeah, and I think too, we always talk about the top part of the class. I think this is also a class that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of holes in it in terms of depth. We've talked about Carson Brune at length, and the reason I bring him up is just because Carson is a guy that, by ranking is one of the lower ranked guys in the class. But you look at him, he had, multiple Power 5 offers. He was a guy that, when you talk to coaches who went by his high school or saw him play, and I'm talking about college coaches, they're incredibly complimentary. They say, hey, that guy's going to fit perfectly at Kansas. And when you have that at the bottom of your class, where you're looking at it that way, I thought they did a good job with that last year too, Swain. And we were talking about it, and you're just talking about the defense and then wanting to get more athletic. I think when you look at last year's class and add it to this year's class, and when you look at what they did at defensive tackle in last year's class with the body types that they went out and got, the Marcus Calvin types and guys like that, and then all of a sudden you're adding this edge talent. You add the linebackers that they were able to get, both in terms of Logan Brantley in last year's class, Kamara, and the way that they've gone in this year's class. And then in this class, I mean, they have flat attacked defensive back. I mean, they've done a really good job of it. And I think we talk all the time about the need for depth, and it used to be you need that in the Big 12. Now you need it across college football in general. I mean, we just saw Lucas Van Ness get drafted in the first round from Iowa without starting a game. I mean, he was in their rotation, but he was and that's the thing, when Brinkley committed, and I realize I'm jumping around a little bit here, but when he committed, somebody had asked me, do you think this will have an impact on Warner or vice versa in terms of, hey, one of them might go? And I was just thinking, well, there's only 2 defensive ends in the class. I mean, they can both play at the same time. But even beyond that, I think that the way college football has gone and the need for depth and everything else, if you're in that rotation and you're getting those opportunities and everything, then you're going to have a chance to hit your goals and get on the field quite a bit, because it's all hands on deck. I mean, they want to have enough guys to really rotate through and get a lot of reps on a lot of different guys.
Yeah, and this might be a silly point, but like, look at the best team in college football last year. In the last couple of years, right? It's Georgia. And what do they do? Every single year, they lose 5 defensive starters that are first-round picks. Well, what do they do the next year? They replace them with 5 other first-round picks. It's just something where in college football these days, you need to have kind of waves of depth. And I think you look overall at the recruiting class, right? Building the depth of the defense over the last, high school ranks, whether it be through the portal, they've done that. And so I think overall now it's kind of a question of, all right, well, what's next? And I think there's been, rightfully so, plenty of movement on social media regarding Michael Boganowski, right? The what we would consider probably the number 1 prospect in the state of Kansas, a linebacker from Junction City. He took an official visit to Kansas. He took official visits also to Florida State and Stanford, and then Oklahoma and Kansas State are kind of the other main two. And the other day, KU put a graphic out for its commits to kind of tweet at Boganowski. And this is something that is a very concerted effort, right? These commits all have a group chat and they all get sent a graphic and they say, hey, would you mind sending this at, send it to Michael, tweet at Michael, whatever. And they do it because, of course, these commits want the best for Kansas. So they're going to recruit the guys that can't, the coaches are recruiting as well. And I think it gives another layer where you're seeing a lot of these players just tweet at Michael Boganowski, say, hey, we want you here too. And so it just adds another layer. But in terms of the actual recruitment, Kevin, we've got plenty of questions, more than I can count, whether it be from the message board or on Twitter. Just what's your feel on this recruitment right now? Because the belief is that, he's not going to take a ton of time, right? This isn't going to go into August or September, right? The thought is he's going to decide this month.
Yeah, and if you were asking me to handicap it, I would probably say Oklahoma and Kansas State still seem, like they're out in front. But I will say this. I think Kansas has done a really good job in this recruitment, for one thing. And another thing, too, his dad has a lot of ties to Kansas State. He played at New Mexico State, but he knows a lot of the coaches and has a lot of different connections there. And at the same time, I really have to applaud the way that they've kind of kept it open. They've given Kansas every chance here. It's not the sort of thing where you see guys in every class that are locked into K-State, and it doesn't matter if Kansas comes to them with the best opportunity or whatever else, they're going to K-State. There was a kid a couple of years ago that KU wanted to offer in state, and instead he never came to Lawrence and then took a walk-on spot at K-State when KU wanted to offer him a scholarship. And the hope, obviously, is that as Kansas experiences more consistent success in football, you're going to get some the other way too, right? That there are going to be guys who grew up KU fans and they're going to go that way. But despite all of those ties and everything, and I think if you would have asked us to handicap this thing in January, we probably would have said, hey, K-State or Oklahoma, still took the official visit. They've still, gone ahead and talked to the other Kansas recruits. They've done everything, I feel like, to give Kansas a fair shot in here. It's just a question of, can Kansas kind of get over the hump there? You think about the Kansas State ties. One, the other thing is Brent Venables has a heck of a pitch to athletic Kansas linebackers after having Victor Simmons at Clemson and now Jaron Kanik, who looks like he's going to start at Oklahoma this year. And so I think when you look at that and the fact that Oklahoma, even traditionally, even back when Venables was defensive coordinator at Oklahoma's shown an ability to come into Kansas and kind of poach the top guy when Oklahoma has really wanted him. I think those two would probably be out front if you were just asking me to handicap it. I don't know. Do you have a different feel on this, or what's kind of your thought?
No, I tend to agree. And look, if Michael Boganowski picks Kansas State, it's not going to be because his dad has connections there. It's
Sure.
going to be because he wants to go there. And I think that's probably backing up what you're saying there, Kevin, about I think this is all Michael's decision. Where Michael wants to go, he will be able to go. And Kansas has done its best. They've recruited him hard. They've made him a priority. And it's another situation where if he goes elsewhere, can't you just throw your hands up and say, all right. And I think having recruits tweet this graphic at Michael, having the coaches still recruit him hard, it's just all of a part of Kansas really trying to finish this recruitment strong and do everything they can. And this is exactly what you do when you are trying to do everything you can to land a guy. And so it's just a part of the process. And I think local recruiting, as time goes on, right, as Kansas has more success, they're more consistent as a program, it will change. But we're still in the part of, I think, the local recruiting rebuild is what I'll call it, where there are going to be guys that still KU is going to do everything possible to get, and they're just not going to want to go to Kansas. And that's okay. That's how it works sometimes, right? And so I think, Michael Boganowski could pick Kansas. I'd probably be a little bit surprised if he did at this point, just based on what I've heard. But I'm certainly not going to rule out Kansas, and we'll just have to see where he decides, because I think it's a close one between K-State and Oklahoma. And I think KU's kind of sitting there ready to make a move and trying to make a move in case there's a little crack there or a little opportunity for it to happen. But then there's another guy who is going to make a decision on Friday. So maybe by the time you read or listening to this, he might already be committed. But it is Nick Marsh. It sounds like he's likely Michigan State bound. Yeah, he's someone that was committed to Michigan State, decommitted this spring, took visits this summer, and seems like he's headed back to Michigan State. This has been a wild recruitment to follow, as there's been twists and turns, and this is one where Kansas was in it. And it looks like maybe some family keeping close to home is going to be important for him, right? He's got a very close family. And so I think staying close to home will be important for him. But Kevin, let's just say this broadly. What would the addition of, if Nick Marsh shocks everybody and commits to Kansas on Friday, or if Michael Boganowski commits to Kansas, what would this mean, I think, just for the program overall? And does it mean anything if these guys don't pick Kansas?
Yeah, I don't think it means anything if they don't, because I think, with Nick Marsh, you were fighting a little bit of an uphill battle in general. I mean, that is a stacked recruitment with a lot of heavy hitters in there. He was already committed to Michigan State, and let's put it out there too. Kansas really valued Nick Marsh, and what I mean by that is that Kansas is not going to take a wide receiver in this class, probably, if it's not Nick Marsh. And so wide receiver wasn't a position of need really after they took the 3 in last year's class. And so the fact that they basically said, we know the numbers say what they say, we've got our receiver groups, except for you can come here because we want you this badly, and they let that play out, right? Like, they rolled out the red carpet for him when he visited. They really went guns blazing after him in recruiting. And so I do think with either of these recruitments, if Kansas loses out, it's not the sort of thing where you're going to look back and point to something and say, Kansas lost this guy because of this, or because they didn't recruit him hard enough, or whatever else. And I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus here, but over the last 10 or 12 years before Lance Leipold got here, that wasn't always the case. There were a lot of guys that you could point at and say, this is where this recruitment fell apart. This is where they made the mistake. This is where they didn't value this guy enough. Boganowski being the number one guy in the state, if he picks Kansas, I think it sends a message, because I'm not sure that Kansas is really, to say they're not in on it is kind of a weird way to phrase it. I don't know that they're going to get another top guy in the state in 2024. It might, Boganowski might be it. He might be the only guy. And so I think it's big from that standpoint. At the same time, I'm sure we're going to get a question about 2025 recruiting in here. They've gotten a really early start in state in 2025, and they've done really well there. So I don't think it necessarily hurts you there either. So I know that was a broad question, a really long answer to a broad question, but I mean, what were just sort of your general thoughts on the Marsh recruitment and everything?
Yeah, look, to be mentioned alongside this is a big deal. To get an official visit from a fringe top 100 player nationally, it speaks to, I think, the connection that Chris Simpson has in Detroit. It speaks to, I think, KU's ability to just get a look from some of these players. And I think we talked about at the time, Kevin, right? How big College Game Day was for Kansas,
Yeah,
how big that Arkansas bowl game was. And brand awareness is huge in college football. And there's really not much better to do for yourself brand wise than to host College Game Day in October, first of all, right?
sure.
As college football is really heating up in October. And then also to play in one of the biggest bowl games that has a lot of people talking, right? Everyone was
Yeah,
talking about Jalen Daniels, the overtime, the play with Jason Bean, on the negative side of it, but it got a lot of run publicly. And so I think that really helps the overall brand. And Kansas has really done a great job of capitalizing on it. And look,
sure.
overall, I think the continuity of staff and the importance of that cannot be understated, right? All of these guys, for the most part, had offers going back to last year, right? You're looking at a lot of January, December offers where if you have staff turnover, those guys really aren't getting settled until what, first week of February usually. And then you're all of a sudden you're having to learn people and learn who you're recruiting. And so staff continuity, I think overall played a big role in this class, played a role in Kansas getting in the mix for Nick Marsh. And it doesn't mean anything if they don't get Nick Marsh. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean anything at all. It's okay. They were in the mix for a top 100 player. If they get in the mix for a few more, that's great news as well, because it means there's a better chance that Kansas could land one of those kind of big sharks. And so I think broadly, Kevin, let's get to this question. A lot of people have wondered, right? With a class of this quality, with the class of this many guys with Power 5 offers, right? It's a question I think I've gotten a lot on the message board. It's a question I think you've probably gotten on Twitter too, right?
Yep.
How difficult will it be for Kansas to keep these recruits committed when they're still 5 months from signing day? Quick point, there should be a signing day in August. If kids are really committed, they should be
Sure.
down to sign in August and be done with it. Okay, now you can answer the question that I've gotten that out of the way.
Yeah, it's funny. There was, I think it was Sam Mellinger, maybe it might have been Joe Posnanski, wrote a column for the Kansas City Star when the Royals started to get good, and he was talking about how basically Royals fans were waiting for the bottom to drop out, right? Like they were waiting for, okay, but then this happened. And the line that was in there is, he said, Royals fans feel like there's a monster in the closet. He said, to be fair, for most of Royals fans' lives, there's been a monster in the closet, and that applies to, I feel like, the KU recruiting stuff as well. Look, we all remember the Louisianimals class where Kansas got up to number 4, I think, in the composite rankings. We all remember Kansas getting in for other guys who were really highly recruited and highly regarded guys and highly ranked guys, and then they didn't wind up committing. And I get all of that. I get the angst about it. I get I get the feeling that, oh my gosh, this is going to happen. I mean, even Mark Mangino had a class. I can't remember if it was 04 or 05, where they had a bunch of guys, sort of back out at the 11th hour. And, this has been going on a really long time for Kansas fans. There's a monster in the closet when it comes to taking highly ranked guys and getting them, into the barn, so to speak. And I think I say all of that to say that it's also kind of an unfair question, given that hasn't happened with this staff, for one. For two, none of these guys are committing with the thought of, hey, I'm going to reopen in August, or I'm going to reopen in October, or whatever else. Like, it's not like Dak Brinkley committed and he was like, well, I'm in for the next couple months at least, or whatever. These are guys that are legitimately committing to Kansas with the thought and the idea that they're going to be in that signing class. And I think when you add all of that together with this, and we alluded to it earlier, this is a staff that I feel like is really strong on the recruiting trail, not necessarily at being the salesman, can talk a woman in white gloves into eating a ketchup popsicle. Like that's not really who they are. They're more the relationship based, right?
Yeah.
Like they're more the person that grows on you and you get to know them more. And you talked about how long a lot of these guys have had these offers, how long those relationships have built. And I think when you look at that class, I think that's really important and instructive, in that I think that this is a group that maybe is more likely than previous groups to stick together, because it's built on that foundation of relationships and everything. And don't forget, like, the Louisiana Animals class was already falling apart in the spring. Like it wasn't like all of that group was still together in July, which is where we're at now. So that fall apart sort of happened earlier. Jamar Chase was committed for 8 days. Like it wasn't like let's not sit here and be like Jamar Chase was a long time commit and then oh my god, no, he was committed for 8 days and then he went back to LSU, and so who he was committed to in the first place. So it's one of those things where I do again understand where Kansas fans are coming from and being nervous about these guys staying together. I do think that this class has a better chance than those previous groups to stick together because of those relationships and the way they built.
Mhm.
And I don't think it's a surface level thing. I think it's a little deeper than that. Having said that,
Yeah.
Swain, it's still important for KU to put a good product on the field, I think, to
Yeah.
kind of reinforce what these guys are signing up for.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I think obviously how many times we said last year, Kevin, talking recruiting, right?
Yeah.
Winning cures all in recruiting.
Yeah.
And if Kansas wins 7 games, like these guys will stay committed. Now, if Kansas goes 5-7, I still think 99% of them will stay committed. And here's why. You're looking at this class already having options, right? They
Yeah.
picked Kansas over other options. This wasn't a situation. Um, I'll use Casey Wiseman for an example. He committed after that July visit period when he visited Florida State. If he really wanted to go to Kansas, he would have committed earlier, right? It felt like a situation where a guy's waiting out. All right, well, this is what I got. I guess I should take it. That's not what this class is. This class is guys that had options. They could have gone elsewhere, and they decided that they wanted to be at Kansas. And now you look ahead to this fall, and KU has the relationships built with these players where it's meaningful relationships. Like you said, KU didn't lock these guys in Lance Leipold's office for 3 hours and force them to commit, right? These are guys that had the opportunity. They had the conversation with Lance Leipold. Hey, here's what commitment looks like. You don't really take visits elsewhere. You don't really, talk to other staffs, blah, blah, blah. They basically outline and talk about what it looks like to be committed to Kansas and what Kansas's commitment means to them as well, right? That, hey, we're going to honor the scholarship, blah, 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 things like that. So I think a good example of this is I experienced this when I was at Iowa State. They recruited over their heads traditionally, best recruiting class in program history, stemming from their 2020 trip to the Big 12 title game, winning the Fiesta Bowl, right?
Yep.
That summer, they recruited really well. Again, best class in program history. Folks will probably remember that fall, things did not go well. It was a pretty poor season. It resulted in a bowl game, but losing to Clemson. Well, they only lost one commit, and it was Xavier Townsend, who was from Florida and got basically pushed by UCF to flip, and he did. That was the only decommitment. I don't really see anyone maybe filling that mold right here, where it's a kid far away from home. It doesn't really fit geographically. It doesn't really fit overall. Like these guys all fit the culture. They fit the geographical footprint. I think it overall fits Kansas. And so for me, I think if you're projecting forward, that's what makes me have the feeling that this as a class really feels like it'll stick together because it's kind of built on real life values, not to get too like big picture here, but it's like real life stuff, right? And I think that some of that has the ability to translate wins and losses than the salesman pitch, than having kids be in an office for 3 hours and forcing them to commit or squeezing kids on a visit. Like, I think it's just a different situation. And that gives me at least some comfort in telling fans and telling people that watch this podcast, listen to it, that, hey, there's a good shot that this class will stay together through National Signing Day.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's really well put, because I do think that, it's kind of funny. When you look at that Louisiana class, I always forget
Mm.
one of the 2 seasons they went 1-11, and the other season they went 2-10, and I forget which is which. Like if the kids committed right after the 1-win season, or if they committed after the 2-win season. But then you had another season basically where the bottom dropped out, and I don't see that. I better knock on some wood and everything, but I don't see that happening this year, in terms of the bottom just absolutely dropping out. But even beyond that, I think that, these guys seem to see themselves as, part of the foundation of something bigger. And I get that they're not technically on the ground floor, going to the bowl game, beating Texas in year one, all of that was the ground floor. but you want to keep building. And Lance Leipold does not want KU to be 7-5 every year. He just doesn't. He wants to keep building. And I think when you see and talk to these guys, a lot of them see themselves as being part of sort of that journey. And so if Kansas does go 5-7, like you said, which wouldn't be disastrous, but also, would be a step back. You wouldn't be going to a bowl game, things like that. I don't necessarily see that having, just sort of this boulder rolling downhill impact on this class either.
No, I agree. I agree. So, I mean, Kevin, we're running out of time here. So let's save the class of 2025 talk for a
Sure.
podcast we'll do in a week or two. TLDR, yes, Kansas is getting a head start in the class of 2025, right? Andy Kotelnicki was able to spend a lot of June evaluating tight ends in the next class because he already had his tight end committed. That's a good example of what these coaches are able to do during this period. But I want to end with this question because I feel like we're kind of in the point now where there's maybe like a spot or two left for blue chip guys or a defensive tackle. So we can kind of look back at this class right now and maybe give some grades for the summer as we really kind of get into the next kind of portion of recruiting here. So let's start on the offensive side of the ball, Kevin. What sort of grade would you give Kansas for this offensive haul this cycle so far?
Yeah, it's I would probably give them a B something. I don't know where it would be in that B range, whether it would be a B plus or a B minus or whatever. The most important thing was they had to get a quarterback of the future. I mean, that guy wasn't in the program, whatever else. And you go out and you get Isaiah Marshall. And so that was big. You get two running backs, Carson Brune being a really good tight end. The thing that drags it down a little bit, obviously, you don't have any wide receivers. That was planned theoretically. If they get Nick Marsh, obviously, this grade would change. But I think the other part of it is that offensive line group. It's not that I don't like them, but I feel like they're bites at the apple, so to speak. There's not a
Mhm.
guy that maybe gets me as fired up as like a Calvin Clements, maybe for like a single guy out of that group. But when you look at that group, I think you can see scenarios where, hey, Utley winds up being a really good player, or they wind up being really good guys. But I think that's my one thing is with them not taking wide receiver, with the offensive line group, and them maybe missing on a couple of their quote unquote higher tier guys, if you will. That's kind of where I have them on offense. Where do you have them?
Yeah, I'd probably go B minus because I'm going to put quarterback into its own tier here
Oh, all
in
right,
terms
all
of
right.
grading
So I
it.
ruined it
Um,
basically.
I mean, yeah. For those watching, they'll see that there's a little bit of there's a quarterback at the end of it here. But I think, yeah, I'd probably give B minus. I think Harry Stewart's a really good get. I really like Harry
Yep.
Stewart. I think he's a really good player. I just look at the three offensive line commits in terms of like the players and the recruitments and the profiles. They're the type of players that maybe I feel like, Scott folks can go out and get every single cycle from here until the end of time. Not necessarily ones where it's a huge recruiting battle that Kansas comes out in front of, but guys that you evaluate, you stick to your evaluation and you like. And I think those are the offensive linemen. So I'd probably say B minus. Flipping to the defensive side of the ball now, what would you give them overall as a grade?
Yeah, defensive side of the ball, I go A minus probably, and I realize that sounds high, and a lot of people I think a lot of people would say, well, gosh, you're not recruiting like, Georgia here. Like, how dare you give them an A or whatever? But for what Kansas wants, right? And what Kansas is recruiting for. And we've talked about this not just on this podcast, but on the other podcasts where we've talked about the different guys as they committed. Those safety guys, they fit what Kansas wants from safeties. When you look at
Mm-hmm.
Kamara, as we've talked about, Kamara fits the Craig Young spot. Like you can see these guys and plug them into their specific spots on defense. And you look at the DB group, like I said, they're really good. They fit together really well. They fit the dimensions of what they look for at those positions. I
Mm-hmm.
think getting a defensive tackle would be really good to go with last year's defensive tackle group that I thought was pretty good. But then having the edge guys, as kind of the headliners of that group, when you look at Brinkley and Warner, I'd probably give them an A- for that group. That's the best pass rush duo in terms of two edge guys that I think Kansas has probably had in the recruiting database era. And I went back and looked, and if you're not familiar with our database, that goes back about 20 years or so. So I went back and looked, and I couldn't find a class where I would take two high school guys above those two. And so,
Yeah.
where would you have the defensive ranking at?
Well, honestly, Kevin, I'd go A, because
Yeah,
here's how I look at it, right? I think you mentioned right there, right? This is the best defensive end class they've ever had. This is
yep.
actually the best defensive back class. I'll be writing about this in July. But in terms of average offers, in terms of average 24/7 sports composite rating, this is the best defensive back class Kansas has ever had. So now you're looking at basically the secondary, best group Kansas has ever had. Defensive end, best group Kansas has ever had. Linebacker, I think John Kamara is a guy that long term has NFL potential. I don't think people really understand how good this kid looks. Like 6'4",
He
and he already
could
looks
have
like
the
Craig
best
Young.
ceiling of anybody in this class, offense or defense. I'm not saying he
Yeah,
reaches that ceiling, but I'm saying if you're just saying, "Hey, where's the ceiling?" He may have the highest ceiling out of anybody in
yeah,
this class.
he could be a beast in college. And so,
Yep.
I look at the spots, right, and they have recruits that Kansas brought in for visits, right, and really, who have they missed on? It's like David Kabongo, right? Went to Oklahoma State. Maybe they'll miss on Shima Chineke or Tyler Simmons, but it's a group that you look at who they hit on, who they missed, right? They hit on really the big targets, and as a result, they've really built a strong class. So I'd give them an A on the defensive side of the ball. Now,
I'd
for
bump it to A
quarterback,
plus if Boganowski committed.
maybe I would.
I
Maybe I
mean,
would.
if he does, no, I'm not being a wise ass. Like I would legitimately upgrade them to A plus at that point because what would they have not hit? I mean, defensive tackle, they're going to get a defensive tackle in this class somewhere probably. But you just said best edge group, best defensive back group. If you have Kamara and Boganowski in the same linebacker group too, in addition to all of that, I mean, that's what an A plus defensive class looks like for Kansas, and they aren't that far off.
No, they're not. They're not. And so that's what I would say. And then I think quarterback recruiting, I give you an A minus. Like I just look at Isaiah
Yep.
Marshall, maybe not the tallest guy at 6 foot. That's maybe one knock you have on him. But I mean, Kevin, this is a quarterback running sub 11-second 100-meter times,
Yeah.
right? Has great arm talent. Like as a dual threat quarterback, a guy that could succeed. Come follow Jalen Daniels. God, I can't speak. We're going for 50 minutes here, Kevin. I'm fresh off vacation. I don't have my sea legs back. So I think you look at him as a guy that could come behind Jalen Daniels as a talent. I think he's got all the talent in the world. So I think maybe size would be my one question for him. Durability. Can he do it? 12, 13, 14 games in a season. Obviously it's hard to tell. We'll have to see. But I think overall and then collectively for the class, I think right now I'd give it a solid A minus, B plus, right? Kind of in honestly what kind of a lot of the composite averages are, right? About 88,
Yeah.
89, 90,
Yeah.
about in there. That's kind of where I'm feeling the class is at right now, because I think in terms of the needs, they hit them, right? Looking at defensive end, looking at the secondary, they hit them. Quarterback, huge hit. Where they missed, okay, offensive line. But I think, Kevin, we've talked about this before. Offensive line is one of those positions where either you should be a 5-star or you should be a kind of under the radar recruit in terms of NFL draft guys. So I think overall it's a class that's in a really good position as July gets going. Kevin, any final thoughts about the class and where it's at?
No, I think you're right on the offensive line too. I think Scott Fuchs, is a guy that you kind of say, hey, a guy fits these dimensions. He's got this athleticism. Now go coach him up, and he can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not as important, I don't think, at that spot. But no, I'm right there with you on Isaiah Marshall too. I think you watch his tape and you can pretty much superimpose him over Jalen Daniels highlights. And I'm not saying he's Jalen Daniels. I'm saying he's making the throws and decisions and, throwing the routes and things like that Jalen Daniels is doing. And he's doing it at a really high level. And let's be honest, if he was 6'3" or 6'4", maybe he's not at Kansas. So the height, not being a huge negative from that standpoint. But no, it's a really strong class at this point, and I do think that's going to lead to those of you Kansas fans who are on Twitter. That's going to lead to you eating some comments from K-State fans and opposing fan bases saying, yeah, but what happens when you lose games and all these guys want to go elsewhere? You're just going to have to deal with that for a little while, because nobody would say that to you if your recruiting class wasn't good in the first place.
That's a great end. That's a great way just like drop the mic,
just
Kevin.
drop the mic and walk off. I've got my dog snoring right beside me, so I think she's pretty much told me that she's about ready for it to be done. So
I love it. Well, thanks a bunch, Kevin, for jumping on. I'm sure we'll do another one of these probably later in the month. Probably look ahead to 2025, maybe during that unofficial visit period. As for what's next, I'll be in Dallas for Big 12 Media Days. Kansas will go next Wednesday. I'll do a little bit of a Big 12 Media Days recap podcast for you from my hotel room in Dallas. We'll see if Travis Goff speaks again this year like he did last year. Obviously, I think plenty of news and notes will come from that as Lance Leipold really speaks for, the first time in a couple weeks. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of topics to talk about. So, Kevin, thank you as always for joining, and thank you as always for listening to the Fog.net podcast. We will talk to you again next